White female cop disrespects black judge in court. What happens next? Shock everyone. In a courtroom packed with tension, a police officer sits with smug confidence, certain the system will shield her. Across from her, a calm but determined judge silently prepares to dismantle her lies. What starts as a routine trial soon exposes shocking truths, patterns of abuse, corruption, and unchecked arrogance. By the end, the courtroom is rocked by a verdict no one expected, and justice hits harder than anyone could have imagined. The courthouse in downtown Atlanta stood tall, a stately building of marble and stone that bore the weight of countless verdicts. Its grandeur reflected the ideals of justice, but for many, its halls carried an undercurrent of fear and uncertainty. Today was no exception. Inside courtroom 3C, sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished oak benches. The gallery buzzed with murmurs, a mixture of anticipation and unease hanging in the air. Families of the plaintiff and defendant were scattered among curious onlookers, activists, and a few off-duty officers, their badges barely concealed beneath their jackets. All eyes eventually turned toward the raised bench where Judge Cassandra Blake sat. She was poised, her hands resting lightly on the edge of her mahogany desk as she read through her notes. Cassandra was in her early 40s, with deep brown skin that seemed to glow under the courtroom lights and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Her natural curls were tied back neatly, exposing the slight tilt of her chin that always signaled authority. Her robe, flowing and pristine, only added to her commanding presence. But beneath her calm exterior, Cassandra could feel the tension radiating through the room like a live wire. This wasn't just another trial. It was a reckoning. The defendant, Officer Rebecca Langley, sat at the defense table with an air of arrogance that was impossible to ignore. She leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, her lips curled into a smug smile. Rebecca's platinum blonde hair was pulled into a tight bun, and her sharp blue eyes darted around the room as though she were already bored. She whispered something to her lawyer, prompting a low chuckle from him. It was a moment designed to draw attention, and it succeeded. Cassandra's gaze shifted to the defense table, and for a fleeting second, Rebecca met her eyes. The smirk didn't waver. Cassandra's chest tightened, but she maintained her composure. She had dealt with plenty of arrogant defendants before. Officers who thought the badge granted them immunity. Individuals who saw her presence on the bench as an anomaly rather than a symbol of progress. Today would be no different. "Order in the court," the bailiff announced, his voice cutting through the low chatter. The murmurs died down and the gallery settled. Cassandra lifted her gavel and tapped it once, the sound resonating through the room. "Good morning. The case of Tyrell Jenkins versus Officer Rebecca Langley will now be called to order." Her voice was steady, controlled, but it carried a weight that silenced any lingering whispers. Cassandra's eyes swept over the room, taking in the faces before her. Tyrell sat at the plaintiff's table, his mother beside him. The young man looked nervous, his hands fidgeting with the hem of his suit jacket, but his mother's presence seemed to anchor him. She placed a reassuring hand on his arm, her gaze locked on Rebecca with quiet fury. Rebecca, meanwhile, didn't bother masking her disdain. As Cassandra continued outlining the day's proceedings, Rebecca leaned closer to her lawyer and whispered something again. This time her words were audible enough for the first few rows to hear. "Can you believe this? I have to sit here and listen to this nonsense." Cassandra paused mid-sentence, her pen stilling in her hand. The room grew heavy with the tension of what had just been said. Tyrell's mother stiffened, her nostrils flaring, and even the defense attorney shot Rebecca a warning glance. But Rebecca was unbothered, leaning back in her chair like she owned the room. "Officer Langley," Cassandra said, her voice sharp but measured. "This is a court of law, not a platform for personal commentary. I suggest you adjust your behavior accordingly." Rebecca didn't reply immediately. She tilted her head, her smile growing wider. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, the sarcasm dripping from every syllable. A ripple of discomfort spread through the gallery. Cassandra held her gaze for a beat longer, then turned her attention back to the case file in front of her. She would not be baited. Her role was to maintain control of the courtroom, and she would not allow Rebecca Langley's antics to undermine the gravity of the proceedings. The prosecutor, Dana Mitchell, rose from her seat, adjusting her blazer as she approached the bench. "Your Honor, before we begin, the plaintiff would like to enter additional video evidence into the record." Cassandra nodded. "Proceed." As Dana handed the flash drive to the bailiff, Rebecca muttered under her breath, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "More evidence? As if one video wasn't enough to waste everyone's time." This time, Cassandra's patience thinned. She set her pen down and leaned slightly forward, her gaze piercing through the space between them. "Officer Langley," she said, her tone colder now, "this is your second warning. Disrespecting this court will not be tolerated. The next time you choose to speak out of turn, you will be held in contempt. Is that understood?" Rebecca's smirk faltered, but only for a moment. "Understood," she said, her voice clipped. "Good," Cassandra replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Miss Mitchell, you may proceed." The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as the bailiff prepared to play the video. Dana stood by the screen, her expression solemn. "Your Honor, the footage you're about to see was captured by the plaintiff's phone during the incident in question. It provides critical context to the case." The gallery leaned forward in their seats as the screen flickered to life. The video was shaky, but clear enough to show Rebecca dragging Tyrell out of his car during a traffic stop. Her voice was unmistakable, sharp and filled with hostility. "Get out of the car," she barked, yanking Tyrell's arm as he struggled to comply. "I don't have all day to deal with people like you." The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the video's audio. Cassandra's jaw tightened as the footage continued, showing Rebecca shoving Tyrell against the hood of his car with unnecessary force. "Why are you doing this?" Tyrell's voice cracked in the recording, his fear palpable. "I didn't do anything." Rebecca's response sent a chill through the courtroom. "Maybe you didn't, or maybe you just haven't been caught yet." The video cut off abruptly, leaving the room in stunned silence. Cassandra took a deep breath, her fingers pressing lightly against the edge of her desk. "This is only the beginning," she thought, "and she has no idea what's coming." The atmosphere in the courtroom was heavy with unease as the screen went black. All eyes turned to Officer Rebecca Langley, whose previously smug demeanor had begun to shift. She still sat upright, shoulders square, but her jaw was clenched now, and her fingers tapped against the defense table, a rhythmic, nervous tick that hadn't been there before. Judge Cassandra Blake remained composed on the bench, her face an unreadable mask. She allowed the silence to linger, letting the weight of the evidence settle in. It was a calculated decision. Cassandra knew that silence, when paired with undeniable proof, often spoke louder than words. "Miss Mitchell," Cassandra said finally, her voice steady, "does the prosecution have additional context for the video we just viewed?" Dana Mitchell stepped forward again, her polished heels clicking softly against the tile floor. The young prosecutor had a commanding presence despite her petite frame, and her tone carried conviction. "Yes, Your Honor. The video you just saw was taken by Mr. Jenkins during a routine traffic stop. Officer Langley claimed she pulled him over for a broken taillight, but an inspection of the vehicle later confirmed that no such damage existed." Dana paused, glancing toward the jury, then the gallery. "What's more, Your Honor, the plaintiff will testify that after the video ended, Officer Langley detained him without cause, conducted an unlawful search of his vehicle, and used unnecessary force when he verbally questioned her actions." The murmurs began again in the gallery, hushed but unmistakable. Words like typical and disgrace floated just beneath the surface, only amplifying the charged atmosphere. "Order in the court," the bailiff called once more, his voice carrying a sharper edge this time. Cassandra waited until the room settled, her gaze never leaving Dana. "Does the defense have a response at this time?" Rebecca's attorney, Martin Graves, a balding man in his late 50s, rose from his seat. He adjusted his tie with exaggerated precision, a man clearly buying time to formulate his rebuttal. "Your Honor," he began, his tone oozing false politeness. "While the prosecution's video evidence is certainly compelling, it fails to paint a full picture of the events in question. Officer Langley acted within her discretion as a law enforcement officer to ensure her safety during what she perceived to be a potentially dangerous situation." Rebecca nodded in agreement, her smirk creeping back onto her face as Martin spoke. She leaned back slightly, the picture of confidence. "That's right," she muttered, though not loud enough to draw attention from the judge. Martin continued, his voice growing steadier. "Furthermore, we would argue that the plaintiff's video conveniently starts at a moment that portrays my client in the worst possible light, ignoring the context of her initial interactions with Mr. Jenkins." Cassandra's expression didn't waver, but her pen moved slightly on her notepad, a small, deliberate motion that didn't escape the keen eyes of Dana Mitchell. "Mr. Graves," Cassandra said, her voice calm but firm, "are you suggesting the video evidence was edited or tampered with?" Martin hesitated. "No, Your Honor. I am merely pointing out that it represents only a fragment of the events that transpired." Cassandra nodded, her gaze sharp. "I see. In that case, I trust you will provide evidence to support your client's claims of context and discretion." The courtroom held its breath as Martin faltered, his mouth opening slightly as if to speak, but no words came. Cassandra waited, her silence a quiet challenge. When no answer was forthcoming, she leaned forward ever so slightly. "Very well," she said. "We will proceed." The prosecution called its first witness, Tyrell Jenkins. The young man approached the witness stand with visible hesitation, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the railing. His mother, seated in the front row of the gallery, gave him an encouraging nod. Tyrell drew a deep breath before taking the oath, his voice cracking slightly as he promised to tell the truth. "Mr. Jenkins," Dana began, her tone warm and reassuring. "Thank you for being here today. Can you describe in your own words what happened on the evening of the incident?" Tyrell glanced toward Rebecca, then quickly looked away, his shoulders hunching slightly under her icy gaze. "I was driving home from work," he began, his voice quiet. "It was late and I remember being tired. My shift ran long that day. I was just a block from my house when I saw the lights behind me." Dana nodded, encouraging him to continue. "And what happened next?" Tyrell swallowed hard. "I pulled over like I was supposed to. He gestured vaguely toward Rebecca, avoiding her name. "Came up to my car. She asked for my license and registration, so I gave them to her. I didn't know what I'd done wrong." "And did Officer Langley explain why she stopped you?" Dana asked. Tyrell hesitated, his fingers gripping the edge of the witness stand. "She said my tail light was out, but it wasn't. I checked it the next morning." Dana's brow furrowed. "What happened after that?" "She told me to step out of the car," Tyrell said, his voice growing quieter. "I asked why, but she just kept yelling at me. She said if I didn't get out, she'd drag me out." The courtroom was silent except for the faint scratching of Cassandra's pen as she took notes. Tyrell's mother dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her face a mixture of sorrow and anger. "And did you comply?" Dana asked gently. Tyrell nodded. "I did, but when I got out she grabbed my arm. It hurt. I told her I wasn't resisting, but she slammed me against the car anyway." A faint gasp rippled through the gallery. Rebecca's smirk had all but disappeared now, replaced by a tight-lipped expression. Her fingers drummed against the table faster, a small crack in her previously unshakable confidence. "Thank you, Mr. Jenkins," Dana said. "I know this is difficult, but your testimony is important." As Tyrell stepped down from the stand, Cassandra addressed the court. "This case is not just about one traffic stop. It's about the standards we hold for those entrusted to uphold the law. I expect all parties involved to proceed with respect for this court and for the truth." Her words hung in the air, a pointed reminder to everyone in the room. Cassandra's gaze lingered on Rebecca, her eyes narrowing slightly. It was subtle, But the message was clear. The storm brewing in this courtroom was far from over. Rebecca shifted uncomfortably in her seat. For the first time, the cracks in her arrogance were beginning to show. The courtroom settled into an uneasy stillness after Terrell stepped down from the witness stand. His testimony lingered in the air like a quiet storm, its weight pressing down on every person in the room. Even Officer Rebecca Langley, who had seemed untouchable earlier, now appeared less certain. Her fingers tapped rhythmically on the table, the sound a faint but telling betrayal of her confidence. Judge Cassandra Blake sat upright on the bench, her hands folded neatly before her. The soft glow of sunlight from the tall windows framed her figure, but the warmth did little to soften her sharp gaze. Her presence alone demanded decorum, yet beneath her composed exterior, Cassandra could feel the gravity of the moment pulling at her. Cases like this weren't just about facts or verdicts. They were about justice in a system that so often fell short. She knew the weight of the robe she wore, and she carried it with unwavering determination. The defense was next to call a witness, and all eyes turned to Martin Graves as he rose from his chair. He adjusted his glasses with deliberate slowness, a man who seemed more interested in creating a performance than presenting a case. His movements were calculated, each one designed to project confidence, though Cassandra could sense the cracks beneath the surface. "Your Honor," Martin began, his voice smooth and practiced. "The defense would like to call Officer Rebecca Langley to the stand." The gallery shifted, murmurs rippling through the crowd like a low wave. Rebecca stood, her movements stiff but purposeful. She smoothed the front of her uniform as she walked toward the witness stand, her jaw set. The smirk that had once played across her lips was gone, replaced by a steely determination. Yet as she raised her right hand and took the oath, a flicker of something else crossed her face. Nerves, perhaps, or the faintest hint of doubt. Rebecca sat, her posture rigid as Martin approached her with a reassuring smile. "Officer Langley," he began, his tone warm, almost fatherly. "Thank you for taking the stand. Let's start with the basics. Can you tell the court about your experience in law enforcement?" Rebecca straightened her shoulders, as if the weight of her badge could shield her from the scrutiny she faced. "I've been an officer with the Atlanta Police Department for 8 years, she said. Her voice was steady, almost rehearsed. "In that time, I've handled hundreds of traffic stops, arrests, and investigations. I've always followed protocol and put the safety of the community first." Martin nodded, his expression one of approval. "And on the night in question, you were performing a routine traffic stop. Is that correct?" "Yes," Rebecca replied, her voice growing firmer. "I noticed a vehicle with a faulty taillight and initiated the stop. It's standard procedure." "Did you feel at any point that the situation posed a threat to your safety?" Martin asked, his tone carefully leading. Rebecca hesitated, but only for a moment. "Yes. When I approached the vehicle, the driver, Mr. Jenkins, appeared agitated. He was fidgeting with something, and I couldn't see his hands clearly. For my safety, I asked him to step out of the car." "And did he comply?" Martin pressed. "Not at first," Rebecca said, her tone sharpening. "He questioned my authority and delayed getting out. I had to be firm to ensure the situation didn't escalate." In the gallery, Tyrell's mother shook her head, her expression a mix of disbelief and anger. Cassandra noticed but said nothing, keeping her focus on the witness. Martin continued, his voice calm but insistent. "So, you acted within your training to maintain control of the situation. Would you say that's accurate?" "Yes," Rebecca said, her chin lifting slightly. "Everything I did that night was by the book." Dana Mitchell rose from her seat as soon as Martin finished his questioning. Her expression was measured, her steps deliberate as she approached the stand. She paused briefly, glancing at her notes before meeting Rebecca's gaze. "Officer Langley," Dana began, her tone polite but firm. "You mentioned that Mr. Jenkins appeared agitated when you approached his vehicle. Can you clarify what you mean by that?" Rebecca shifted slightly in her seat. "He was moving around a lot. It looked like he was reaching for something." And what did you believe he was reaching for? Dana asked. I couldn't be sure, Rebecca admitted. That's why I asked him to step out of the car, for my safety. Dana nodded, her expression neutral. I see. And yet the video evidence shows that Mr. Jenkins's hands were visible on the steering wheel when you approached. How do you explain that? Rebecca blinked, her composure faltering for the briefest moment. The video doesn't show everything, she said quickly. There were moments before and after that weren't recorded. Dana tilted her head slightly, her gaze piercing. So you're saying the video is incomplete? Yes, Rebecca said firmly. It doesn't tell the whole story. Dana let the statement hang in the air for a moment, then took a step closer to the stand. Officer Langley, can you explain why, despite claiming to feel threatened, you didn't call for backup during this traffic stop? Rebecca's mouth opened, then closed again. Her fingers gripped the edge of the stand. I didn't think it was necessary at the time, she said finally. Dana raised an eyebrow. You felt threatened enough to pull Mr. Jenkins out of his car and use force against him, but not enough to call for backup? That seems contradictory, doesn't it? Rebecca's jaw tightened and a flicker of irritation crossed her face. I acted on my judgment in the moment. Of course, Dana said, her voice cool. One last question, Officer Langley. In the video you can be heard saying, "People like you." What exactly did you mean by that? The room went utterly still. Rebecca's face paled slightly, her composure crumbling at the edges. She began, but the words caught in her throat. It wasn't meant the way it sounded. Then how was it meant? Dana pressed, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Rebecca's silence spoke louder than any answer she could have given. In the gallery, someone let out a low whistle, and the bailiff immediately called for order. Cassandra tapped her gavel once, the sound sharp and final. This line of questioning will continue tomorrow, Cassandra announced, her voice calm but firm. Court is adjourned until 9 a.m. sharp. As the room began to empty, Rebecca sat frozen in the witness chair, her confidence now a fragile facade. Cassandra watched her for a moment longer, her expression unreadable. The storm was far from over, but the cracks were beginning to show. The next morning, Courtroom 3C was packed once again. Word of the trial had spread, and the gallery now held more faces than the previous day. Activists, local community leaders, and even a few reporters had managed to squeeze into the rows. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation, the room alive with unspoken questions. What would happen next? Could Officer Langley maintain her shaky defense? Judge Cassandra Blake entered the courtroom with her usual calm authority. Her robe flowed behind her as she approached the bench, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. She took her seat, adjusted her papers, and let her sharp gaze sweep over the courtroom before speaking. This court is now in session, she said, her voice steady. We will resume the cross-examination of Officer Langley. Miss Mitchell, you may proceed. Dana Mitchell, the prosecutor, stood at her table. Her movements were deliberate, her posture upright but not rigid. As she approached the witness stand, her face remained composed, though her eyes carried a quiet intensity. She knew today's line of questioning could determine the trial's outcome. Rebecca Langley sat in the witness chair, her uniform neatly pressed, her shoulders back in a show of confidence that seemed more forced than natural. Her eyes darted briefly to her attorney, Martin Graves, who gave her a subtle nod. It was a futile gesture of reassurance. Dana's relentless cross-examination yesterday had already planted seeds of doubt in Rebecca's testimony. Dana stopped a few feet from the stand and clasped her hands together. Officer Langley, she began, her tone calm but edged with steel. Yesterday we discussed your actions during the traffic stop involving Mr. Jenkins. I'd like to revisit a few points to ensure clarity for the court. Rebecca shifted slightly in her seat. Of course, she replied, her voice clipped. Dana took a small step closer. You stated yesterday that you felt threatened during the traffic stop. Is that correct? Yes, Rebecca said, her tone firmer now, as though clinging to the remnants of her narrative. You also mentioned that Mr. Jenkins appeared agitated and was moving in a way that raised your suspicions. Dana continued. However, the video evidence showed his hands on the steering wheel as you approached. How do you reconcile this with your claim? Rebecca hesitated, her fingers tightening around the arms of the chair. The video doesn't show everything, she repeated, though her voice lacked the confidence it had carried the day before. Dana nodded as though she expected that response. Let's focus on what the video does show then. In the footage, you can be heard saying, "People like you." When asked yesterday, you couldn't explain what you meant by that. Have you had time to reflect on your statement? The question hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. The gallery was silent, all eyes fixed on Rebecca. She swallowed hard, her lips pressing into a thin line. She began, then stopped. Her gaze flickered toward Martin, but he offered no lifeline. I misspoke, she said finally. It was a poor choice of words. Dana tilted her head slightly. A poor choice of words, interesting. Tell me, Officer Langley, do you often misspeak during traffic stops? Or was this an isolated incident? Rebecca's jaw tightened. It was isolated, she said through gritted teeth. I see, Dana said, her tone still calm. And yet, when reviewing your personnel records, we found multiple complaints filed against you for similar behavior, complaints that were either dismissed or quietly resolved. Would you care to address those? A ripple of murmurs swept through the gallery, quickly silenced by the bailiff's sharp call for order. Rebecca's composure visibly cracked. Those complaints were baseless, she snapped. People just don't like being held accountable. Dana raised an eyebrow, her expression unflinching. Baseless, you say? So every person who filed a complaint against you was lying? Rebecca's face reddened. I didn't say that. Dana pressed on, her tone growing sharper. But you implied it. Officer Langley, is it possible that your pattern of behavior, your quickness to escalate situations, your frequent use of excessive force, has contributed to the perception that you abuse your authority? Rebecca's eyes narrowed, but she didn't respond immediately. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable. Cassandra leaned slightly forward on the bench, her presence a quiet but commanding force. Officer Langley, she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The prosecutor has asked you a direct question. Please answer. Rebecca's lips parted, but no words came. The weight of the judge's gaze seemed to pin her in place. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I acted within my training. Dana's lips pressed into a thin line, a clear sign she wasn't satisfied. Let's move on, she said, stepping back slightly. Your Honor, the prosecution would like to enter additional evidence into the record. Cassandra nodded. Proceed. The bailiff approached with a small stack of papers, handing them to Cassandra, who examined them briefly before passing them to the defense. Dana turned back to the courtroom, addressing the jury now. These documents, she said, her voice steady, are internal reports from the Atlanta Police Department. They detail Officer Langley's involvement in multiple incidents of questionable conduct, including the planting of evidence and falsified reports. These patterns cannot be ignored. The gallery erupted into hushed whispers, the shock palpable. Even the jury exchanged uneasy glances. Rebecca's composure shattered completely, her face pale and her hands trembling slightly. Cassandra tapped her gavel once, the sharp sound silencing the room. Order, she said, her tone calm but firm. She looked directly at Rebecca. Officer Langley, these are serious allegations. Do you wish to respond? Rebecca's head lowered, her voice barely audible. I was following orders. The room fell into stunned silence once more. Dana seized the moment, stepping closer to the stand. Following orders? Are you suggesting that you were directed by your superiors to engage in misconduct? Rebecca hesitated, realizing the trap she'd walked into. No, that's not what I meant. But that's what you said, Dana pressed. So which is it, Officer Langley? Were you following orders, or were you acting on your own judgment? Rebecca's silence spoke volumes. As court adjourned for the day, Cassandra watched Rebecca from the bench, her sharp gaze unyielding. The once arrogant officer now looked small, her bravado stripped away. Cassandra knew the hardest truths were yet to come, but the cracks in Rebecca's armor were growing wider. Justice, slow and deliberate, was beginning to take shape. The morning air was crisp as the sun filtered through the tall courthouse windows, casting long shadows on the polished floors. By the time court reconvened, the room was packed tighter than ever. The case had captured the city's attention, and the stakes had never been higher. Every seat in the gallery was filled, and a line of hopeful spectators stood outside, eager to witness the next chapter of the unraveling drama. Judge Cassandra Blake entered the courtroom promptly at 9, her presence immediately silencing the chatter that had built up in the minutes before. As she took her seat at the bench, her gaze swept across the room, pausing briefly on Officer Rebecca Langley. The officer's once confident posture had diminished further. Her back was hunched slightly, her hands clasped tightly together on the defense table. If Rebecca had any hope left, it was buried deep beneath her mounting anxiety. Cassandra tapped her gavel once, the sound sharp and deliberate. "This court is now in session," she announced. Her voice was calm but carried the weight of authority, a stark contrast to the growing tension in the room. Prosecutor Dana Mitchell rose first, her movements calculated and composed. She approached the bench with a single folder in hand, her heels clicking softly against the tiled floor. "Your Honor," Dana began, her voice steady, "the prosecution would like to call its next witness, Sergeant Michael Carter." The murmurs in the gallery grew louder as the name was announced. Sergeant Michael Carter was a respected figure within the Atlanta Police Department, a decorated officer known for his integrity. His reputation as a straight shooter preceded him, and his presence in this trial was unexpected. Rebecca's eyes widened, her face visibly paling as the tall, broad-shouldered man in a neatly pressed uniform made his way to the witness stand. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to hide. As he took the oath, his sharp, dark eyes briefly met Rebecca's before settling on Dana. Dana stepped closer to the stand, her expression firm but respectful. "Sergeant Carter, thank you for being here today. Can you please state your position within the Atlanta Police Department for the court?" Carter nodded. "I'm a sergeant with the Internal Affairs Division. I've been with the department for over 15 years. And as part of your role in internal affairs, do you oversee investigations into officer misconduct?" Dana asked. "Yes," Carter replied. "It's my job to ensure that officers adhere to departmental policies and that any allegations of misconduct are thoroughly investigated." Dana's expression didn't change, but her tone shifted slightly, becoming sharper. "Sergeant Carter, are you familiar with Officer Rebecca Langley?" Carter's jaw tightened slightly, but he nodded. "Yes, I am." "In what capacity?" Dana pressed. "I've been involved in multiple internal investigations concerning Officer Langley's conduct," Carter said, his voice firm. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Rebecca's attorney, Martin Graves, shifted uneasily in his chair. Rebecca herself looked as though the floor had fallen out from beneath her. "Sergeant Carter," Dana continued, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "can you elaborate on the nature of these investigations?" Carter leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the edge of the stand. "Over the past 3 years, there have been several complaints filed against Officer Langley. These complaints include allegations of excessive force, racial profiling, and falsification of reports. In each case, there was sufficient evidence to warrant further investigation." Dana nodded, her tone neutral but her words precise. "And what were the outcomes of these investigations?" "Most of the cases were dismissed due to lack of cooperation from witnesses or insufficient evidence," Carter explained. "However, there were instances where disciplinary action was recommended, but those recommendations were either reduced or ignored by higher-ranking officials." The gallery murmured again, the implications of Carter's statement sinking in. Cassandra tapped her gavel twice, bringing the room back to order. "Sergeant Carter," Dana said, her voice taking on a sharper edge, "in your professional opinion, Were these decisions to dismiss or reduce disciplinary actions justified? Carter hesitated for a brief moment, but his gaze remained steady. No. In my opinion, the department's handling of these cases demonstrated a pattern of protecting certain officers at the expense of accountability. Rebecca's composure was crumbling. Her hands trembled slightly, and she avoided eye contact with anyone in the room. Martin Graves leaned toward her, whispering something urgently, but she didn't respond. Dana stepped closer to the stand, her voice growing more intense. "Sergeant Carter, have you reviewed the body camera footage from the night of Mr. Jenkins' arrest?" "Yes, I have," Carter replied. "The footage clearly shows Officer Langley using excessive force and making racially charged remarks. It's a clear violation of departmental policy." Dana let the weight of his words hang in the air before asking, "And what steps did Internal Affairs take after reviewing this footage?" "We recommended immediate suspension and an external investigation into Officer Langley's actions," Carter said. "However, those recommendations were overruled by the department's leadership." Rebecca's head snapped up at this, her expression a mix of shock and anger. For the first time, her voice broke through the silence. "That's not true," she shouted, rising to her feet. Cassandra immediately tapped her gavel, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Officer Langley, sit down. You are out of order." Rebecca froze, her outburst silencing the room. Slowly, she sank back into her chair, her face flushed with anger and fear. Cassandra's gaze lingered on her for a moment before turning back to Dana. "Miss Mitchell," Cassandra said, her voice calm but firm, "you may continue." Dana didn't miss a beat. "Sergeant Carter, based on your experience, would you consider Officer Langley's actions that night to be part of a larger pattern of behavior?" "Yes," Carter said without hesitation. "Her actions align with the complaints we've received over the years. This isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a disturbing trend." The courtroom was electric, the tension palpable. Cassandra leaned forward slightly, her sharp gaze fixed on Rebecca. "Officer Langley," she said, her tone low but firm, "do you have anything to say in response to Sergeant Carter's testimony?" Rebecca's lips parted, but no words came. For the first time, her confidence was entirely gone. She looked to Martin, who simply shook his head, knowing any statement she made would only dig the hole deeper. "Very well," Cassandra said, leaning back in her chair. "The court will take a short recess before proceeding with final statements. We will reconvene in 30 minutes. As Cassandra tapped her gavel and rose from the bench, the gallery erupted into hushed conversations. Rebecca remained frozen in her seat, her face pale and her hands gripping the edge of the table as though it were the only thing keeping her grounded. Justice was no longer a distant concept. It was closing in, and Rebecca Langley was running out of places to hide. The courtroom returned to session after the brief recess, but the mood in the room had shifted entirely. The gallery was buzzing with energy, the tension from Sergeant Michael Carter's damning testimony still lingering like a heavy fog. Every eye was on Officer Rebecca Langley, whose once impenetrable arrogance had all but evaporated. She sat hunched over at the defense table, her face pale and drawn, her hands clasped tightly together, as if she could hold herself together through sheer willpower. Judge Cassandra Blake took her seat at the bench, her sharp eyes scanning the room before landing on Rebecca. There was no trace of emotion in her expression, only the quiet authority of someone who had seen the arc of justice bend, even if painfully slow at times. Cassandra tapped her gavel once, calling the court back to order. "We will now hear closing statements," she announced. Her voice was calm, but carried a gravity that made everyone sit a little straighter in their seats. "Miss Mitchell, you may proceed." Dana Mitchell rose from her seat, her every movement deliberate and composed. She walked toward the jury box, letting the silence stretch for a moment before she began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Dana said, her voice clear and unwavering. "What you've seen over the past few days is not just a case about a traffic stop gone wrong. It's about a pattern of abuse, of arrogance, and of unchecked power." She gestured toward Rebecca, who avoided her gaze. Officer Langley did not act in the interest of public safety that night. She acted with prejudice. She profiled Mr. Jenkins not because of what he did, but because of who he is. A young black man driving home from work. Dana turned to the jury, her tone growing more impassioned. The evidence is clear. The video footage, the internal reports, the testimony of Sergeant Carter, all of it points to a systemic failure. Officer Langley believed she could act without consequences because for years the system protected her. But today we have the opportunity to hold her accountable. She paused, letting her words sink in. Mr. Jenkins deserves justice. The community deserves accountability, and this court deserves the truth. I trust you will deliver a verdict that reflects those principles. With that, Dana returned to her seat, her head held high. The gallery was silent, the weight of her words pressing down on everyone in the room. Martin Graves stood next, adjusting his tie as he approached the jury. His steps were slow, almost hesitant, as though even he was unsure of his own argument. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone softer than usual. "This has been a difficult case. Emotions are running high, and the evidence presented by the prosecution is certainly compelling. But I urge you to consider the context." He glanced briefly at Rebecca before continuing. "Officer Langley has dedicated 8 years of her life to law enforcement. She has faced dangers most of us cannot imagine, and in doing so she has made difficult decisions. Decisions that, while imperfect, were made in the interest of safety." Martin's voice grew firmer, though it lacked the conviction of Dana's argument. "What happened that night was not an act of malice. It was a mistake, a lapse in judgment under stressful circumstances. We all make mistakes, and it is not fair to judge an officer's entire career based on one incident." He returned to his seat without meeting the jury's eyes, his argument hanging weakly in the air. The jury deliberated for less than an hour, but to everyone in the courtroom, it felt like an eternity. The tension was palpable as they re-entered the room, their expressions unreadable. The foreperson handed the verdict to the bailiff, who in turn passed it to Judge Blake. Cassandra unfolded the paper with steady hands, her eyes scanning the words before looking up at the jury. "Has the jury reached a unanimous verdict?" she asked. "We have, Your Honor," the foreperson replied. Cassandra nodded. "In the case of Tyrell Jenkins versus Officer Rebecca Langley, on the charge of excessive force, how does the jury find the defendant?" "Guilty," the foreperson said firmly. A ripple of relief and murmurs spread through the gallery, but Cassandra tapped her gavel once, restoring order. "And on the charge of falsifying reports?" "Guilty." Rebecca's head dropped into her hands, her shoulders shaking slightly. Martin Graves placed a hand on her arm, but she didn't respond. Cassandra's gaze remained steady, her voice calm as she addressed the courtroom. "Officer Rebecca Langley," Cassandra began, her tone firm but measured, "this court finds you guilty of the charges brought against you. Your actions have not only harmed an innocent man, but have also eroded trust in the justice system you swore to uphold." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "You are hereby sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. Additionally, all cases involving your conduct will be reviewed by an independent committee." The gavel came down one final time, its sound resonating through the room. "Court is adjourned." The courtroom was nearly empty as the final gavel came down, the sound echoing like the final note of a somber symphony. Outside the courtroom, the usual bustle of courthouse activity continued, but inside, there was a stillness that felt almost sacred. The jury had made their decision, the judge had delivered her verdict, and the oppressive air of uncertainty that had hung over the room for days was now replaced with a quiet sense of closure. Judge Cassandra Blake sat behind her bench, her fingers lightly tapping against the polished wood. The case was over, but in the quiet aftermath, she couldn't help but reflect on the magnitude of what had just transpired. The trial had not only been about justice for one individual, but about exposing the cracks within a system that too often allowed power to go unchecked. She glanced down at the case file in front of her, her mind momentarily drifting back to the moment when she had first seen the footage of Officer Rebecca Langley's treatment of Tyrell Jenkins. That moment, that raw, undeniable proof of misconduct, had been the turning point. It was what had set the wheels of justice into motion, and what had ultimately led to Langley's conviction. Cassandra's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. "Come in," she called, her voice calm but commanding. The door opened and Tyrell Jenkins stepped inside, his mother by his side. The two of them stood for a moment, taking in the sight of the woman who had ensured their fight for justice had not been in vain. Tyrell's mother, a woman of quiet strength, gave a small, appreciative nod to Cassandra. Tyrell, still processing the weight of the verdict, looked at Cassandra with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I never thought we'd get here. I never thought this would happen." Cassandra gave him a soft smile. "You're the one who stood up, Mr. Jenkins. You're the one who made sure your voice was heard. All I did was make sure justice was done." His mother, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. "What you did today, what you did for our son, it means everything," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "We'll never forget this." Cassandra nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of the moment. "I didn't do it for thanks. I did it because it was the right thing to do." For a brief moment, the three of them stood in the quiet of the chambers, each of them taking in the significance of the moment. Tyrell's mother placed a hand on his shoulder, as if to ground him in the reality of their victory. Tyrell's eyes, though tired, were filled with a quiet resolve, a resolve that had carried him through the darkest moments of the trial and had, in the end, brought him to this point. Cassandra's gaze softened. "Justice doesn't always come easily," she said, her voice low but certain. "But it always has a way of finding its path, even when we think it's lost." As Tyrell and his mother left her chambers, Cassandra turned back to her desk. Her fingers brushed over the case file, her mind still processing the weight of what had transpired. The trial had been an exhausting battle, but it had also been a victory, not just for Tyrell, but for everyone who had been wronged by a system that had too often turned a blind eye to injustice. She knew this case would be remembered, not for the spectacle of the trial itself, but for what it represented. A stand against corruption, a refusal to tolerate abuse of power, and the unwavering belief that the law should protect all people, regardless of their race or background. Her phone buzzed on the desk, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from one of her colleagues at the courthouse. "Great job today, Cassandra. You've made a difference." She smiled, her heart swelling with pride. The message was simple, but the sentiment was powerful. Cassandra knew the road ahead would be filled with more battles, more cases where the truth would be difficult to uncover. But she also knew that each victory, no matter how small, brought the world one step closer to the justice it deserved. As she prepared to leave for the day, Cassandra paused at the door of her office, looking out at the bustling courthouse below. The world outside was moving quickly, but for her, time seemed to stand still for a moment. She thought about the countless cases that had passed through her courtroom over the years, each one with its own complexities and challenges, but none quite like this one. This trial had been different. It had been a reminder that justice was not just about ruling on laws and procedures. It was about standing up for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against you. And as Cassandra walked out of her office and into the bright sunlit hallway, she knew this case would stay with her forever, just as it would stay with Tyrell, his mother, and every person who had watched it unfold. Justice had been served, but the fight for it, that would continue, and so justice was served. A fearless judge who stood unwavering in the face of prejudice, and a system that could no longer shield those who abused their power. This story reminds us that accountability matters, and no one is above the law. If this story resonated with you, inspired you, or left you thinking, make sure to subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss another powerful story like this one. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.